I'm going to be talking about the historical origins of the Korean War, particularly with an eye towards understanding US aims in Asia against the DPRK and China. Now, before I begin, I do want to make a note about why it is that this is so important. Um, at Noruto, we are not just concerned with knowing the past for intellectual reasons or bearing witness to the present as a kind of ethical duty. Our primary concern is the struggle for the future, and that's reflected in our name, Noruto, which means stepping stones in Korean. Our study of the past is concerned with constructing a path into the future. And that brings us to the relevance of this history towards the future of Korea, because in the case of the Korean War, the past is not past. It is an ongoing war that remains a problem to be solved in order to understand what a liberated future might mean and how we might arrive there. And given the particular circumstances of the Korean War, the rigorous study of history is important because what most of us know about this war is more myth than fact. Now, what are these myths? Let's review the dominant narrative of the Korean War, which most of you are probably quite familiar with. The story goes something like this. Once upon a time, there were two Koreas. The Korea in the south was free, but the Korea in the north was a Soviet puppet. One day, North Korea invaded South Korea to spread communism, requiring the United States to intervene under the banner of the United Nations. The US saved democracy in Korea and to this day safeguards the South from a belligerent actor in the North. Now, even if we take this dominant narrative on its own terms, there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered. Why was Korea, a nation united under a single polity for more than 1,000 years, suddenly divided after World War II, despite the fact that Korea was not an aggressor in the war, unlike Germany, which was the only other country to meet this fate? If North Korea did invade South Korea under the instructions of the Soviets, why did the Soviets themselves not participate in this war, or for that matter, launch its own offensives elsewhere? And if the United States intervened in Korea to protect democracy, how can it be that South Koreans themselves do not consider democratization to have occurred until the late 80s or even the early 90s, more than a generation after the armistice in 1953? Answering these questions requires us to correct the historical narrative. The Korean War has been primarily classified as a Cold War conflict, and that has distorted our perception of the war's causes, which is also due in no small part because the US has exaggerated the role of the Soviet Union. Now, the Korean War was shaped by the external environment, but it also arose from circumstances that were internal to Korea at the time. Fundamentally, this war was a struggle for the future between opposing class forces in Korea, following 35 years of brutal and direct Japanese colonial rule. Prior to colonization, Korea was a feudal society where the majority of people were peasants whose labor produced the country's wealth. And then there was a minority of landlords, also known as yangban, who seized that wealth for themselves. During colonialism, Japan relied upon this landlord class to exploit Korea as an agricultural colony. The peasantry had to pay taxes and rent with the crops that they planted and harvested, mainly rice. Then Japanese companies sold that rice for a profit, none of which went to the peasants who actually produced it. When the peasants were eventually pushed off their land by debt and hunger, Japanese capitalists exploited them once again as workers. These class distinctions were essential to maintaining Japanese rule over Korea. Japan needed Korean peasants to grow food. They needed Korean workers to labor for cheap in factories. And eventually, they needed Koreans as draft fighters in its military, and particularly women to make up the bulk of those who were conscripted into a system of military sexual slavery known today as the comfort women system. Japan couldn't force the masses of Korean peasants and workers to do these things without Korean landlords, Korean police willing to collaborate with them. Resistance to colonialism therefore arose from class exploitation, and what that meant was that the peasants and the workers were the ones who formed the real core of the national liberation movement in the colonial era. And many of these people were influenced by Korean communists who were seeking to make socialist revolution. The origins of the Korean War are therefore in the class distinctions that arose during Japanese colonialism. By 1945, a decades-long struggle had already taken place to liberate Korea from imperialism. But once Japan was defeated in World War II, the struggle had to continue because Japan may have been defeated, but neither imperialism as a world system nor the Korean collaborators in league with imperialism were defeated. This is when the politics of the Cold War enters the picture. The decision to divide Korea was made solely by the United States. Just days after bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, US military officials drew a line across Korea and declared two occupation zones, one Soviet, one American. The reason they needed to declare a Soviet zone was because the Soviets were already in Korea. What dividing Korea accomplished was to stop the Soviet advance and keep a toehold in Asia for the United States. After the US announced its decision, the Soviets acquiesced and observed the 38th parallel as a dividing line in Korea. Meanwhile, among Korean people themselves, most people were just not aware of the events transpiring in Washington. After all, no decision makers in the Pentagon had bothered to ask a single Korean person. And in the meantime, Koreans were already organizing for our own independence, from the smallest villages to the greatest cities. People's committees were formed to maintain order in communities, to take back stolen land from Japanese imperialists and their collaborators, and to welcome back revolutionaries who were freed from prison or returned from exile. Not all Korean people were necessarily united in ideology, but because the vast majority of the society was of a peasant background, there was a broad unity of material interests against the remnants of colonialism and in favor of total independence. On September 6, 1945, just a few weeks after Japan's surrender, these people's committees were ready to declare the formation of an independent Korean People's Republic. Enter the United States. The US military arrived in Korea just days after the People's Republic was proclaimed. The US military did not recognize the authority of the People's Committees, and they bristled at the agenda to seize private property and return it to the masses of working people. Because what does that sound like? It sounds like communism. Instead, the US military declared itself the government of Southern Korea, and within months, US troops were waging open war on the People's Committees. Who was at the side of the US military government in Korea? It was the same reactionary forces that had served Japan, the landlords, the former police officials, the military officers, the bureaucrats. And on the surface, the US celebrated itself as a decolonizing force in Asia. And I'm not exaggerating there, they used that word. In reality, the United States actually subsumed an existing colonial structure into its own imperialism, after which after World War II became the dominant form across the world. So the two sides of Korea therefore embarked on two very different trajectories after 1945. In the North, the People's Committees continued as the democratic basis of a new government and a new social order built from the ground up by the masses of Korean people through the leadership of the Workers' Party of Korea. And this was not just achieved through the party, but through mass organizations that existed in all spheres of life and participated in the implementation of important democratic reforms, which occurred within a single year. Some examples include a massive land reform that transferred over 2 million acres to 700,000 peasant families, the first gender equality laws in Korea's history, more advanced, I would argue, than what exists in South Korea or the United States today, a mass literacy program, the nationalization of all industry, and the first democratic local elections in Korea's history. In the South, meanwhile, the old collaborators clung to power, and the free market ideology introduced by the occupying Americans actually gave the landlords and police even more free rein to exploit the people than under colonialism by Japan. Just over a year after the US occupation of Korea began, in the fall of 1946, the Southern Peninsula exploded in rebellion as the remaining people's committees, trade unions, and farmers' associations rose up against their oppressors with the support of communists in the South. By 1948, 3 years into the occupation, a guerrilla war had begun in the South. The cause of the guerrilla war was the attempts by the US to hold a UN-monitored election in Southern Korea. Now, we might think of the UN as only a positive force in the world, but we have to understand that the US wanted a UN-sponsored election because only in Southern Korea, because this was the only way to ensure that communists would not lead an eventually independent Korea. And they knew that they could achieve this through the UN because at the time, the Soviets were boycotting the UN due to politics concerning China. Now, when the time to vote came, peasants were forced to the polls under threat of losing their rations because the military had been providing them with rations after their free market ideology wrecked the price of rice and introduced the possibility of mass starvation. And even extreme right-wing forces in South Korea boycotted this election because it was universally understood that what these elections would do would not be to create an independent Korea, but to create a divided Korea. So the guerrilla war that began started in the large island of Jeju, which is off Korea's southern coast. Then the nearby cities of Yeosu and Suncheon on the peninsula were the site of a mutiny of Korean soldiers who refused to repress that rebellion in Jeju. Throughout 1948 and 1949, peasant guerrillas fought bitterly against the illegitimate Republic of Korea that had been proclaimed. The new Republic of Korea, known to most people as South Korea, and the remaining US military retaliated with brutal violence. In Jeju alone, it's estimated that between 30,000 and 60,000 people were slaughtered before the official date that we are told the Korean War began. Many of the tactics deployed locally echoed America's genocidal past and presaged the counterinsurgent tactics that would be used in wars to come. One Korean observer noted that the American tradition of lynching had been introduced to Korea through the Jeju massacre. The other tactics that were used include the burning of entire villages, policies that identified civilians as enemy combatants, the indiscriminate use of torture and rape as weapons of war, the justification of mass violence in the name of anti-communism, and the use of local actors to perform the dirtiest deeds, which if you studied wars in Vietnam, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, you will know that these are things that the US military continues to do. Now, this history is totally absent from the official account of the Korean War, which usually places the origins on solely June 25th, 1950, when the Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel. But by that point, there was already a war that had been taking place in Korea for years. This war was really an extension of the prior war for national liberation that Koreans had fought as a people for decades. The two sides in this war were roughly the same as the sides that existed under colonialism. On one side, you had the masses of organized peasants and workers, many of them under communist leadership. And on the other side, you had the landlords, the capitalists, and other collaborators who had once served Japan, but were now allied with the United States. When the DPRK, or North Korea, marched south, its aims were to complete the struggle for national liberation that had begun decades before and was being artificially prolonged by the unnatural division of Korea and the occupation of the South by US forces. We should also note that the point of who actually started the fighting on June 25th, 1950 is disputed, and I would highly recommend the book that Noah plugged earlier, The Hidden History of the Korean War, to get a better investigation of that. The DPRK has always maintained that the South struck first, and the earliest records from the time actually indicate widespread confusion on all sides about how the fighting began, with some indications from the US Army itself that the South may have actually attacked first. There is little doubt that North Korea intended to march south, but they also only had about half of the divisions that they needed ready for battle when the war officially began on June 25th. Furthermore, there had been skirmishes along the 38th parallel initiated by either side for about a year already. We know now that the US was also likely aware that the Korean People's Army, the DPRK's forces, were amassing soldiers at the 38th parallel for months beforehand. Yet in all official communications from the United States in the summer of 1950, they stressed that this was a surprise attack. And that narrative of North Korean aggression was very instrumental in justifying the US's entry into the war. And by and large, that's the narrative that stuck. All these years later, it is worth asking what exactly the US had to gain from this war back then, and what it still has to gain from prolonging it today. To tackle that last question, I want to take us on a slight detour. As the lead up to the Korean War was occurring, another showdown was also simmering in Washington, the start of McCarthyism. McCarthyism is usually thought of in the United States as only a domestic issue, but it actually had origins in events in Asia. Senators McCarthy's charge of communist infiltration in the government began after the triumph of the Chinese Revolution in 1949. The halls of the Capitol shook with the question, who lost China? McCarthy had the answer. It was the communists and queers, in his language, in the State Department. So what was arguably America's most famous Red Scare was also a moment of yellow peril and lavender scare. The picture starts to become more complete when we consider that McCarthy was among the most influential contacts of a woman named Sung Mei-ling, who was also known as Madame Chiang Kai-shek, wife of the leader of the Republic of China, or the Nationalist Forces of China. China was so important in the United States in 1950 because for more than a century, the US had been benefiting enormously from China's semi-colonial status. China provided workers that built US railroads and agriculture. It was an enormous export market for many of the United States' earliest industries, going all the way back to the fur trade, to grain in the 19th century, the development of agriculture in what we now call the Midwest. So it's not an exaggeration to say that the fate of the US has always been entwined with the fate of China. China going communist was disastrous from the perspective of the United States because it meant that China could no longer be freely exploited. So with China lost, preserving Taiwan as a foothold of US influence in Asia was absolutely critical to many of the leading imperialists of the day, including General Douglas MacArthur, who was the commander of UN forces in the first half of the Korean War, from 1950 to about 1952, I believe. The Korean War provided an opportunity to corral forces in Washington to back the defeated Republic of China, which by then was only limited to Taiwan, where it remains to this day. During the war, MacArthur especially also attempted to extend the conflict at various points into a general war against the Soviet Union and China. These included air raids into Soviet and Chinese territory, as well as plans to eventually deploy Chiang Kai-shek's soldiers in Korea. All the while, MacArthur was cheered on by Senator McCarthy and his allies in Washington. Another aspect of US motivations in Korea had to do with rebuilding Japan. The US kept its war headquarters and all the warplanes it used against Korea in Japan throughout the entirety of the war. Japan was able to rebuild its economy by providing essential goods and services to the US military. This was the explicit policy in Washington at the time. It was a crucial goal of Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who had a theory of establishing a Great Crescent that would flow from the Persian Gulf into East Asia, with allies in Iran and Japan in particular as the anchors of that. At the same time, the Korean War also had a global economic effect. Noah really importantly and astutely identified some of this when he spoke earlier about its role in establishing price controls and also in influencing the politics behind wages. The end of World War II, however, had also caused a slump in worldwide demand. The Korean War reinvigorated that demand and drove the reindustrialization of former Axis powers, not only Japan, but also West Germany. Domestically, it also revived the military-industrial complex initially built in World War II. Defense spending quadrupled in the first few months in the first half of 1950 and remained at that level pretty much ever since. Many of the wartime factories that otherwise may have closed in the US were saved. Korea was also the first so-called police action where the US entered a war without consulting Congress. We may not think about that today, but that is supposed to be unconstitutional, but the fact of the matter is that that's just how the US has conducted its wars ever since. So in many ways, the Korean War birthed the United States as we know it today. Now, if all of this does sound eerily familiar, that's because US interests in Korea remain pretty much the same. The massive joint war games in Korea that now take place on pretty much a monthly basis, if we're being honest, are a huge driver of increasing Pentagon budgets year after year and securing new lucrative contracts for companies like Raytheon and Boeing year after year. More than 70 years later, Korea is still a primary field for the US to escalate against China. Washington still wants to obliterate any anti-hegemonic project anywhere in the world. China and the DPRK are two clear examples of this, and especially important not only because of their socialist orientation, but because they now threaten US military supremacy in the most lucrative region for capitalism in the entire world, which is Asia.